Okay, so have you ever, like, really wished you could just climb inside the brain of someone crazy successful? Like, figure out what makes them tick?
Yeah, like get their cheat codes for life.
Totally. And today, we're basically doing just that because we're going to unpack the mind of Charlie Munger.
Ah, Munger. Warren Buffett's right-hand man at Berkshire Hathaway.
Exactly. And before anyone tunes out thinking this is about stocks,
hmm
it's not. This isn't about what to buy. It's about how to think.
And Munger is famous, infamous maybe, for this thing he calls a lattice work of knowledge. It's honestly kind of brilliant.
So it's like the more you know from all different areas, the better you are at making decisions, right?
100%.
Hmm.
Munger's whole deal is drawing wisdom from everywhere. He's into psychology, history, physics. Like, the guy's a sponge for knowledge.
He's not just like a one-trick pony laser focused on one thing.
Absolutely not. He'd say, being a one-trick pony is a recipe for disaster. You gotta have all the tools in the toolbox, yeah.
So instead of just being a hammer looking for a nail.
Which he actually calls that the man with a hammer syndrome. Yeah. You end up seeing every problem as something to hammer, totally missing the bigger picture.
Right, right. So you're saying with this lattice work idea, you've got more like a whole Swiss Army knife ready for anything.
Exactly. And each of those tools, metaphorically speaking, is what he calls a mental model.
Mental models. Okay, so break that down for me.
Basically, they're like these essential ideas, these core principles, but from all these different fields that you can then apply to almost any situation.
Okay, so give me an example. How does that actually work in real life?
Let's say you understand the laws of physics, right? Like basic stuff. But Munger would argue that even those basic laws can actually give you a totally new way to think about, I don't know, economics, even human behavior, stuff that seems totally unrelated.
It's about making those connections, those surprising links between things that at first glance seem totally separate.
Yes. And to illustrate that, there's this great anecdote about Thomas Hunt Morgan. He was this Nobel Prize-winning biologist. Super smart guy. Anyway, when he took over the biology department at Caltech, he did something kind of crazy. He banned calculators.
Wait, hold on. He banned calculators from a science lab. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Right. You'd think it was the opposite. But he had this reason, a really good one. He wanted his students to focus on deeply understanding the big ideas in biology first, like the real fundamental principles, not just crunching numbers before they really get it.
So it's like, what's more valuable? Memorizing a bunch of formulas or understanding the core concepts that those formulas are trying to explain?
It's more like panning for gold, right? You got to move a lot of dirt to find those little nuggets.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got this lattice work of knowledge, these mental models. But Munger also talks about psychological biases. He even calls them misjudgment tendencies. What's that all about?
Well, he sees these biases as these, like, traps almost, like built-in ways our thinking can get messed up if we're not careful.
So, like, what kind of traps? Give me an example.
Things like overestimating our own abilities or being swayed by what everyone else is doing, that kind of thing. We're all susceptible to them.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think we can all relate to that. So he's not saying don't have these biases. It's more like be aware of them so you can outsmart them.
That's exactly it. And he's got these really interesting names for some of these tendencies. Like, have you ever experienced Persian messenger syndrome?
Persian messenger. Remind me about that one again.
Okay, so you know how it is. Someone brings you bad news, and your gut reaction is almost like to get mad at them, even though they're just the messenger?
Oh, yeah. Like, don't shoot the messenger.
Yeah.
But it's not just about literal messengers, Charlie. It's bigger than that.
Way bigger. It's about how our brains naturally just shy away from unpleasant information. Like, we don't want to hear it, even when we really need to.
And that obviously leads to some bad decisions if we're not careful.
All the time. But once you see it, this bias, you start noticing it everywhere. Not just in yourself, but in other people too.
Okay, that's just one. What are some other misjudgment tendencies that Munger really focuses on?
Oh man, he's got a whole bunch, but a few of the big ones. We've got incentive-caused bias, which is huge and everywhere. And then there's deprival superreaction tendency, which is super relatable. This one's about how much we hate losing something we almost had.
Oh yeah, like that thing you bid on online and lost. Suddenly you want it more than ever. Okay, so those are a couple. Should we dive into those more?
Let's do it. I think everyone will recognize themselves in at least a few of these. It's pretty fascinating stuff. Okay, so incentive-caused bias. This one is huge, and it's everywhere.
Okay, yeah, so break that down for me. What's he talking about there?
It's all about the hidden forces that are kind of always at work, shaping how we behave. you know? The rewards and punishments that nudge us towards certain choices. Like, even if they're small, sometimes, especially if they're small, we don't even realize it's happening.
So you're saying, like, it's not enough to just think about what someone says they want. You got to look at the incentives that are actually driving their actions.
Exactly. Think about it. If you want to get someone to change their behavior, you don't just lecture them about it. You change the incentives, right?
Hmm. That's interesting. So it's almost like
Yeah,
we're all kind of wired to respond to these incentives, even if we don't realize it.
totally. And sometimes those incentives can create some, well, pretty messed up outcomes.
Okay, yeah, give me a real-world example of that.
Think about something like, I don't know, the subprime mortgage crisis. Loan officers were like incentivized to approve as many mortgages as possible. It didn't really matter if the borrower could actually pay it back or not.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a perfect example of how incentives can get out of whack and lead to, like, a huge mess.
Exactly. And the thing is, this doesn't just apply to like big complex systems like the housing market. It's happening all the time on a smaller scale in our own lives.
That's really interesting. So really, Munger is saying, if we want to understand why people do the things they do, we've got to look beyond their words and really pay attention to the incentives that are shaping their behavior.
You got it. Okay, so another big one, deprival super reaction tendency. This one's super relatable. It's that feeling you get when you like almost win the lottery, you know?
Oh, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Like, that money feels real,
Yes.
even though you never actually had it.
Exactly. Or like, remember that time you were bidding on that, what was it?
Oh, the vintage record player online? Oh,
Yeah.
my gosh, yes.
That's the one. And the price just kept going up, and suddenly you're way more invested than you ever planned to be.
Because I almost had it. It's like
Yeah.
this weird psychological thing.
Totally. And it doesn't just apply to, stuff, material things. It could be relationships, job opportunities, anything we feel like we were this close to having.
It's like the fear of missing out, but even more intense because it felt attainable, just within reach.
You nailed it. So how do we fight back against this almost had it feeling?
I think one way is to try and reframe the situation. Like, instead of obsessing over what we've lost, we could try to focus on what we do have. Right? It's about shifting your perspective, focusing on the positive instead of dwelling on the what-ifs.
And then the other thing, too, it's like just reminding yourself, hey, just because it didn't work out this time doesn't mean there won't be other opportunities down the road.
That's really good advice. It's easy to get caught up in the moment and lose sight of the bigger picture. Okay, what's another one of these misjudgment tendencies we should be aware of?
Okay, this one is practically unavoidable. Everyone's experienced it. The social proof tendency. It's that whole, well, everybody else is doing it
Yeah.
mentality.
Yeah, that's a classic. And it makes sense, right?
Hmm.
Like, from an evolutionary standpoint, if you see everyone running away from something, your instinct is to run too.
Yeah.
Better safe than sorry, right?
Exactly. But these days, it can get us into trouble. It can be tough because, like, fitting in, being part of the group, it feels good, right? But sometimes that desire to conform can lead us down the wrong path.
For sure. Like, think about things like fashion trends, fad diets, or even just going along with a bad idea at work because nobody else is speaking up.
Yep. Social proof is powerful stuff. And honestly, I think it's even more powerful now with social media and everything. It's like we're constantly bombarded with messages about what everyone else is doing, what they're buying, what they're thinking.
It's easy to get caught up in that and lose track of our own internal compass.
Totally. So how do we fight back against that? How do we avoid being swayed by the crowd? It takes conscious effort, for sure. One thing you can do is really try to figure out like what you value, what you believe in. And once you've got that figured out, don't be afraid to be the one who asks, okay, but why are we doing it this way? Even when everyone else seems to be on board.
Yeah, it's about having the courage to think for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable or goes against the grain. That's not always easy. It's kind of like you got to be willing to stand out from the crowd, even if it feels a little weird, right?
Yeah, totally. It takes guts to go against the grain like that, to not just follow the herd. But Munger would say that's what real independent thinking is all about. And that's how you make better decisions, by thinking for yourself.
And, one of the things I find really cool about Munger is he's not just like preaching this stuff from on high. He actually lives it. The guy's constantly learning, even now. I mean, talk about a lifelong learner.
Oh, absolutely. This is a guy who's always pushing himself, always trying to learn new things and expand his horizons. He's not afraid to look silly, to ask questions, to admit when he doesn't know something.
I like that because sometimes it feels like the older we get, the more we think we're supposed to have it all figured out. But Munger's like, nope, not even close. And he's not afraid to laugh at himself along the way.
Exactly. He even once said, "It's not supposed to be easy. Anyone who finds it easy is stupid."
I love that. It's such a good reminder that real learning, real growth, it takes effort, you know? And sometimes it's going to be uncomfortable, but ultimately it's always worth it.
100%. And one of the tools that he uses to make sure he's not taking the easy way out, he calls it inverting.
Inverting. Okay, now you got to explain that one.
Okay, so think of it like this. Instead of just trying to figure out, like, how do I achieve success or whatever, he starts by asking the opposite question.
Like, how do I avoid failure?
Exactly. What are the things that would guarantee a miserable life? What are the things I absolutely need to avoid doing?
So it's like work backward from the bad outcome to figure out how to prevent it in the first place.
Yeah. And once you identify those pitfalls, those potential points of failure, you can then start to build strategies to avoid them.
I think we've all probably had moments where if we just stopped and asked ourselves that inversion question, it could have saved us a whole lot of trouble.
Right. And Munger actually tells this funny story about how he used this inversion principle to give a graduation speech. His son was graduating from high school, right? And instead of giving like the typical follow your dreams kind of speech, he decided to flip it on its head.
So he's giving a how to guarantee a miserable life speech at his son's high school graduation. That's amazing.
I know, right? Total Munger move. So anyway, he gets up there and he lays out this list of like surefire ways to make yourself completely unhappy.
Okay, so what's on the list? How do you guarantee a miserable life, according to Charlie Munger?
Well, he talks about things like, holding on to resentment, letting envy eat you alive, basically anything that closes you off to new experiences, new ideas, new perspectives.
It's like he's saying that the path to misery is paved with closed minds and closed hearts.
Exactly. And the thing is, it's so easy to fall into those traps, especially as we get older. It's easy to get stuck in our ways, to stop being curious, to stop challenging ourselves.
So it's almost like success isn't just about achieving certain things. It's about avoiding the things that make us miserable. It's about constantly striving to learn and grow and become better versions of ourselves.
Exactly. It's not just about accumulating knowledge. It's about using that knowledge to live a better, more fulfilling life.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the mind of Charlie Munger, what's like one big takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the biggest thing is just the importance of staying curious. Don't be afraid to ask questions, to challenge your assumptions, to learn from people who are different from you. Keep building that lattice work of knowledge.
Beautifully said. Because ultimately, learning isn't just something we do in school. It's a lifelong journey. And it's something that can bring us immense joy, growth, and fulfillment. So go forth and learn, everyone. And remember, the real reward is the journey itself.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating mind.